Hi everyone, welcome to another tutorial. So in this video, I'm going to be building something that is, from a visual point of view, very simple. There's not really a lot going on here. You know, if the user was to just get this app and start to run it, they'd be like, this is simple. And it is pretty simple under the hood, but it's using some really good practices that I think are useful for, especially for larger projects. So we're basically going to build a app that lets you see all the Magic the Gathering cards. For instance, I can click on one of these and see the details about it. And the ones that have an image associated with it, we can see this here. So that's what we're going to be building. And we're going to be using things like Riverpod, we're going to use AutoRoute, we're going to use Dio, and we're going to use Freezed, as well as a few other little things to get this working. The inspiration for this video originally was I just want to show people how to do infinite scroll, which this allows. You can kind of see it just kind of keeps scrolling forever, but it's only actually making an API request when it gets to the end of the current state of the list. And from there, I thought let's add some more stuff and just kind of set this up as if it was a production app. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so I have a basic Flutter app started here, and this was just made with Flutter Create. And all I did was kind of get rid of some of the comments and got rid of the home page. And here it is, our very basic app, which just says hello world in the top left corner here. Now we're going to install some dependencies. So I have a whole bunch that we're going to install here, and I'll just paste these into the console. So we're going to be installing freezed annotation, build runner, freezed, JSON annotation, infinite scroll pagination, Dio, Riverpod, and AutoRoute, as well as the AutoRoute generator. And there they all are installing. Now we'll be going through each of those individually, so don't worry if you don't know what these do yet, as it will become very clear as we go through this tutorial. If we open up our pub spec now, we will actually see these dependencies has been added, freeze annotation, JSON annotation, etc., as well as some dev dependencies. Now, we are using build runner, which will allow us to generate files, which is super helpful. And just to make sure that's all working, I'm just going to write dart run build runner build, just in the terminal here. And we'll just make sure this doesn't throw any errors. We see a success down here, so we are good. We didn't really generate anything, so we don't have any code that is requesting to be generated yet, but it is installed and working. Next thing I want to do is just get some scaffolding set up for our project structure. We're going to keep this really simple. We're just going to have a source folder, and that'll be inside the lib directory, so lib source. And we're going to make a few directories here, so I can just do make dir, and we will do screens. We will also make one for components, providers, services, and models. And we'll see that those are all here and ready and waiting for us. Then inside some of these things, we'll make some starting files. So I'm going to start with the model, and we're just going to make something. I'm going to call it MTG Card instead of just card. And that's because card is already a word in Flutter, a widget in Flutter, and we don't want to have to worry about importing the correct one when we're using our auto importing. So we're going to have a model there, which we'll get to in a bit. We're also going to want to have a service. So I'm just going to call this MTG service. And we'll start by also creating some files for our providers. So we're going to have an MTG card list provider.dart. And we'll make another one for the detail. So that'll be MTG card detail provider.dart. And that's good for the providers. Screens, we're going to have we could just call this home screen, but I'll call it MTG card list screen.dart. And we will also have a detail screen. There we have it. A few more files we'll be making. We'll be making some components, but we can get to those at the right time. All right, first I just want to get the routing set up for our very basic app. So we're going to go into this and we're going to generate a stateless component, stateless widget, and we'll call this MTG card list screen. And we're going to want to return a scaffold since it's a screen. And let's just for now put an app bar, and we can give it a title text of MTG, for example, and then we'll give it a body. And now we have this lovely screen. I'm going to copy this and go to the detail screen and simply just make this a detail. Okay, now we're using a package called AutoRouter, which is a really cool package that just makes routing, I think, really easy to work with. And what we want to do then on our screens to make this a route page, we're going to decorate it as a route page. And we'll see how we get the autocomplete for that, importing from AutoRoute. So we'll do that, and we'll also do the same for the detail screen. Now, one difference that the detail screen is going to allow is it's going to be a detail for a very specific card. And we're going to build this in a way where this will work well in theory on web. One thing about when you're building, web-based Flutter apps is that sometimes someone might come to a page in your app that's a deep link. It's not just the root of your app, like when you launch it from your iPhone, if it's just a native app. So I want to build this in a way as if that could potentially happen. It's just a good practice. So we're going to, rather than, I think in a normal Flutter app, you might just pass the entire card model, which I know is something we haven't built yet. We're just going to be passing the ID so that this screen in itself, as long as it knows the ID, it can go off and basically get that data for us. So in order to allow that, we will be passing an ID. So it's going to be a string, and we're going to make this a required parameter, this.id. And with AutoRoute, we want to decorate this parameter with something called path param. And in here, we pass the name of the parameter, ID. So you can see these match up. And we'll see what this means in a moment. And just to prove that this works, let's make this, instead of being a const, we'll actually just take the ID so that when we come to this screen, we'll actually see, what it is. All right, so now what I want to do is I'm going to make a new file right in the source directory just called router.dart. First of all, we want to import AutoRoute because we're going to be using that. So we'll import AutoRoute. We're also going to make this part of another file. It'll be a file called router.gr.dart. So it's basically like a generated file that is inside, that is going to be auto-generated as a sibling to this file. And when you're using parts, it basically treats it as if it's the same file. So anything that's imported in that one, this will have access to, and vice versa. So we got that, and what we're going to do is, first of all, start with the decorator. And this is just a helper decorator for the generator called AutoRouter config. And what we're going to do is actually make something called our app router. We could call this router, app router, we could call it anything. But what's magic is it's going to extend this class that doesn't exist yet. And in here, we're just going to list some routes. So the way this sort of works, it's actually going to be an override of this class. So we can just do override. And it's going to return a list of routes, which are denoted as auto routes. And it's actually a getter, because it's not going to be something we pass anything into. And it is just going to return an array or a list. And within this list, we're going to set two different routes here. And we want to denote the first one as initial true, because it's basically the route that will be loaded initially. And we're just going to set its path here to just a /. So think of paths just like you do in a web URL, which of course Flutter can build to web. So this would basically be, the root of our application. So I'm just going to save this file, and we'll just put a trailing comma there so it looks a little bit nicer. And we're going to rerun that build runner. So we'll see here it's going and generating some things. And I'll show you what it generates when we are done. So what the build runner just did, it actually looked through our project for anything denoted with that decorator, like we have on this detail screen, the route page decorator. And if we actually open up this app router, which is now green because it is actually generated file, generated class within this file that this is part of, we'll actually see instances of this thing called MTG Card List Route, Detail Route, etc., etc. So those have been generated, meaning we can actually now work with these. So what we're going to do is now set the page equal to MTG list MTG Card list route dot page. And I'm just going to duplicate this. And the second one's not going to be an initial, but it's going to be, I'm going to make it /cards/ and then we put in a URL parameter. And we'll make this say the detail route. Now this ID here, see how there's a colon in front of it? It's essentially saying like this is a dynamic variable. And you have to make sure that this ID lines up exactly with how you call it here. Now I'm actually using the same here as well, just to keep it really simple. And unless there's a good reason, I recommend doing it that way. But yeah, we got that going now. Lastly, and we'll just rerun the generator because we made some changes to our generator here. Lastly, we're going to want to go to our main.dart. And right now we're returning a material app, but instead we're actually going to return a material app.router, which no longer accepts a home as an option because it's going to rely on the routes. What this does allow for now is a router config. We can pass in a configuration here and our router will take over all the navigation. So we need to get access to this AutoRoute. And in my opinion, the best way to do that is actually to have a singleton that represents it. So right in our main.dart, just to keep things simple, we're going to make a reference. We're using something called getIt, which is a singleton library. And in order to import it, we can just import package. So we'll import that. Then, right before we run our run app, we're just going to take our instance of getIt. This is the instance here, and we're going to say getIt, and we're going to register a singleton. And within here, we are going to pass in the app router. And we want to also set this generic to app router, just so getIt knows what it's an instance of, so we can get all the lovely IntelliSense. Okay, so that's registered now, and then down here, all we have to do is go getIt, and then we get the same generic app router, then we can go .config. So this part gets the instance of the app router, and then we actually run this config function, which is something built into AutoRouter. We still have to, in our router, any screen that we want to access, we need to import it in here as well. So if I do that, and then rerun our build runner. And lastly, we also just have to import foundation into here, or something that will have foundation, like material. And that's because these files need access to certain parameters. Now we see this error here, and that's because we've set getIt, but because we haven't done a full rebuild, it was never initialized. So we can just do a green arrow rebuild. And we see this, we have our title and hello world. So let's just play around with the routing to make sure it's working. So I'm going to go to our list screen. And instead of saying hello world, let's just put a elevated button, and child can be test. And to make this work, what we can do is go AutoRoute.of_context. Sorry, AutoRouter.of_context. We have to get rid of this const because now we have something dynamic. And we can go .push. Now, instead of pushing named or pushing by passing in the screen, what we're actually going to be passing in is a route. And how this works is we can just go MTG card detail screen. Instead of screen, we're looking for the detail route, which is an auto-generated class. And we will see that this is having an error because it's requiring this thing called ID. So let's just take the ID, and now I don't actually have any real IDs, so we'll just do test 1, 2, 3. So there we go. And now if we click this, it'll bring us to the next screen, and that next screen is looking for what the ID is and putting it here. There you go. So we have some dynamic routing now. Now that we got that out of the way, let's get into some data fetching. So I do want to make it clear that this tutorial, whether we're getting magic cards or Yu-Gi-Oh cards or data for your users and the blog posts they make, it doesn't really make much of a difference. We're just showing some practices here that will be useful in many cases. For this example, though, we are using this cool API for Magic the Gathering. And just to give you a look at it, we can go here, There's no authentication required or API keys or anything, so it's really easy to use. I imagine there's some rate limiting, and you might get into that error if you're really spamming this thing. But basically, the slash cards endpoint will return this list of cards. I just have this JSON extension installed so that I can kind of see it in a better way. And within this array that we get back, there's things like, the rarity of it, or the name of it, or the ID. That's the string that we're going to be using for our routes later. There's also an image URL, which is nice. You can, see an image URL here. Now, what we're going to be using is freezed for this. And freeze is a way that you can create data classes by just writing like the most minimal amount of code really possible, and it extrapolates it into a full generated class that has things like 2 JSON methods, or copy widths, or checking identity of things, so on and so forth. So to get this going, we're going to first of all import freeze, and then we're going to make this part of a file called mtgcard.freeze.dart and mtgcard.g.dart. So I just have those up there for us. And I'm just going to paste this in and explain it rather than type it out and waste everyone's time. So basically what we do with freeze is we create the name of our class the way we want it, and we inherit or use with to do this generated class that's going to be existing in one of these two files here. I do like to do this here. This just allows it so we can actually create our own getters and our own functionality on the model rather than it just being a data class itself. And then we create a factory, and here we just pass in all the things. So we're going to be having an ID coming back, a name, a type, a rarity, image URL, and text. Now, this API has a lot more than that. The data coming back, you'll see there's things like set and power and toughness and everything like that, and feel free to, of course, use those. You might just have to learn whether or not some of these things are null. When I was setting up this project, there were things like power that were sometimes coming back null, so just be wary of that and make sure you identify them like this. Okay, so we have this, and this is our to JSON or from JSON function, which again is just going to be a generated function. So we can pass in that data and it will generate a card based on the factory. Now we have a lot of errors, obviously. So let's just save this file and we'll rerun our generator. Okay, and we'll see here that these files were generated. Now, if I reveal this in Finder, we'll actually see that there's a freeze and a g.dart, which are, these files here. Okay, so we have a model now, so let's work on our service. So I'm going to open up the service, and we're just going to make a class. We're going to call it MTG service, and it's not going to inherit anything. It's just its own little class. And what I'm going to start by is setting a base URL for this service. So it's going to be using api.magicgathering.io/v1, meaning if the server went down and there was a backup, we would only have to change it in one place. So we'll just have that there. And what we're going to do now is essentially create a internal function called get. And this is just to do like a get request. And if our server supported post or put or delete, we would obviously want to make them for those, but this is going to be a read-only project. And the way this is going to work is we are going to pass in a path as the first parameter, and then optionally we're going to be able to pass in a page. If it's not set, it'll just be 1 by default. So first we'll create the URL, and that's actually just going to be taking our base URL and then appending the path as well. So that'll be the full URL. Then we're going to construct our parameters. So this API allows you to pass a page as a get parameter, and we're just going to set that to page. And again, by default, it will be 1. And then what we're going to want to do is actually get a response here. So final response, and we're going to be awaiting, and we're using something called do here. So let's get that imported. Okay, and in do, we'll construct it, and we'll run do's version of get by passing in that URL, this URL right here. And then we can also pass query parameters by going query parameters, params. And now what we're going to actually want to return is not the response, but the response.data. Okay, so now we have that sort of set up, and let's make a way to get our magic cards. So we're going to create a new function here. This one will be public, meaning we're not going to denote it with the underscore. And we're going to want to import in our MTG card. This is just that model we just made, because it's going to return a future of a list of MTG cards. So in here, we're going to want to first get our data, and we can just get that by awaiting our lovely get function. And the path is just going to be /cards according to their API. And you'll see I have a page here that we can allow being passed in. We'll make it a required parameter and pass in page there. We could, of course, do the same thing here, but I'm okay with just requiring when we want to actually list cards to always pass in a page. Now, data is going to return essentially if we look at this right here, it's actually not returning the cards as the array. The very top level is cards. So we want to make sure we look within there, cards, and we're going to map through, basically list through all of those. And for each card, we're going to want to return an MTG card from JSON and pass in this right here. And at the very end, we're going to convert it to a list. Now, one other thing we need to do, because this will be dynamic, we need to denote what the map is going to be, each item within the map is going to return, and we can just do that by setting a generic here of MTG card. Okay, so we got list cards. I'm going to copy and paste this and just do one for the detail. We'll call it retrieve card. And instead of passing in a page, we're actually going to pass in a string of ID. And this one's actually even simpler. Maybe I should have started with this one, because all we're actually going to do here is, we also need to get rid of this because it's not going to be a list, it's a single one, future. So we get the data, and then all we're going to do is construct it based on that. So just to show you how this actually looks from the API's point of view, I'll just grab one of these random IDs, and it's actually just /cards/ the ID. So if we go here, and here we get one card back. So instead of a huge list, now there's a lot more detail in here, which is also part of the reason why I think it's good to build it the way we're going to, where the detail view needs to capture the data itself. And sometimes that's common in APIs, right? You might have a list view that has just the most basic stuff that only the list really cares about, like a title and subtitle and an ID, and the detail view API call might have a lot more info. So in short, we need to make sure we are getting data card, not just the data itself, because our model starts basically here. Okay, next up, we need a way to essentially put this data into a list. And we're going to start that off by creating our list provider here. So what I'm doing, I'm importing Riverpod, which we'll see a little more about shortly. I'm also importing this package called Infinite Scroll Pagination, which is super handy. We're importing our model, and we're importing the service. Now, the way this is going to work is we're going to create something called an MTG card list provider. It's going to extend Riverpod state notifier, and the state is going to contain a list of magic cards. Then when we construct this, we're essentially going to want to instantiate our paging controller, which is something we set up here. And this paging controller is part of this scroll pagination library, and it essentially takes care of all the annoying things about, detecting, oh, we got to the end of the page, let's load more. And we've set to pass in a fetch page function, and I've created this here, fetch page, which takes a parameter of page, and we get the cards back by just hitting that list cards endpoint that we just made with that page number in there. And then we just go pagingcontroller.append page, and we pass in the cards and add one to the page so it knows what the next page should be. Then what we're doing is we're just updating our state. We're taking whatever our existing state is, and by default, it is just an empty list. And we are going to combine it with whatever cards came back here. Now, astute viewers may notice as we get further in this that we're actually never accessing this. We're just using the paging controller in this tutorial. But there is a lot of benefits to this for, if you were to break this out into a more thorough application where you want to know a bit about the state and use Riverpod's consumers and watchers to understand things about it. Lastly, I've created a function that just allows you to refresh it, and it basically just clears the state and then calls the paging controller.refresh. Then what we just need to do is construct this. We're calling it MTG card list provider. It's a state notifier provider, which is an instance of MTG card list provider, this guy right here. And we have to say what's inside of it, list of MTG cards, and then we just construct it. And this is the thing we will access throughout our widget tree, the MTG card list provider. So let's get that going. So let's start by making a component, and we're just going to call this MTG card list. And this will be the actual list component itself. So let's just make a stateless widget, and we will call it MTG card list. And what we're going to do is we're going to wrap, let's get rid of this const, and we're going to wrap this with a builder. And not just a normal builder, we're going to use what's called a consumer. And this is part of Riverpod. And rather than just taking context, it has 3 parameters here. We're going to ignore the what's called child, but we still have access to context. And then we have this thing called ref. Now, ref is really cool because ref allows us to talk to our Riverpod providers. So I'm going to make something just called provider, and it's going to be equal to ref.read. And we want to read specifically the MTG list card provider, its notifier specifically. So not the model, not the data within it, but its class itself. And that's how we do that. So this will now be access to basically this class right here. Okay, so now within here, we're going to create a paged list view. Now, the page list view is part of the infinite scroll pagination package. And what it requires us to do is set, okay, the pages are going to be represented by ints, which should usually be the case. I don't know why it wouldn't. And what type of data is going to be in this list? Well, it's going to be an MTG card. And then what we need to do, well, we should probably import this, is we need to set its paging controller. And its paging controller is just going to be the provider.paging controller. So that's just a reference to this lovely thing right here. Then we need to set a delegate. And this is essentially what it uses to build the contents of the list. And here we have access to context like usual, but we also have access to the item itself. I'm going to call it card since that's what it is. And we still have access, like in a normal list view, the index. And here we have the builder delegate, and one small mistake. Let me just get this here. Well, we actually, the builder delegate, we actually have to make a paged child builder delegate. And then in here, we set the item builder to what I just had here. Now, it's also what we need to do is define, okay, what is this? And this should match this right here. So the generic MTG card. Then here, and for now, I'm just going to return, text. And what's cool, because we are denoting these things, it knows that card is an MTG card. So I can just go something like card.name. And let's just add a trailing comma here to make it a little bit nicer. And let's just see if this even works. We are going to get an error, I guarantee it. We're not yet because we're not actually accessing this. Let's go to our screen, MTG card list screen. So right now we're just returning this thing. I'm going to get rid of everything and just do this MTG card list here. And this can be a const. Now here we're going to have an error. No provider scope found. And that's because in our main.dart, we also need to, before we do the run, let's get rid of this const for a minute. We're going to wrap this in a widget in provider scope. And we can just make this whole thing a const. So this gives anything below this, which is going to be our entire app, will have access to Riverpod scope. And we definitely need to do that. Now we will have to do a green arrow rebuild here. And here we have this lovely list. Look, all of our lovely magic cards are coming in. And if we're quick enough, we can kind of catch that there's a loading thing when it gets to the bottom, and then it loads in. So there we have infinite scroll, which was the first goal for this tutorial anyways, but let's take it a little bit deeper now. So let's, instead of just having text coming back in this list, right now we have this text, let's actually make a list tile that represents this. And I'll make this a new component, MTG card list tile. Here, we have this component. It's going to take a parameter of the card, and we're just going to have a title and a subtitle. So we can replace our text now with that, MTG card list tile, and pass in that card. So we name things right, everything just auto-completes as we'd want. So now it's a little bit nicer, it has some padding, it has a title and subtitle. Now, just to speak to this a little bit more, so obviously title is just card.name. Now, if you were to look in the API, there's nothing called card.label. Now, actually see this is a getter we created ourselves, and all it is taking the type and then putting brackets and then the rarity within it, just so we have a nice way to do that. If you are having an error trying to do something like this in Freeze, it's likely because you're missing this line here. This line is necessary if you want to create custom methods or custom getters or anything like that. Okay, so now lastly, what we can put in is we can do that redirect that we had before in our little test button, where we have we pass using that card ID now to there. So now if I click this, I will actually go and I'll see the ID, which is cool, but kind of useless. So let's make that a little more useful. So now we're going to get into a different type of provider. So we kind of have this list provider, Riverpod state notifier. It's great. But we're going to create a detail provider. So we're going to import Riverpod. We're going to import our model for this, and we're going to import our service. And we're using a future provider.family. So a future provider.family is a way that you can essentially have a reference in memory of something based on a certain input. In this case, the input we're using is a string, and we're actually going to be referencing it to the ID. So essentially, once we, if we try and access this and it doesn't already exist in memory, it'll go and run this function, retrieve the card by that ID, and then it will be in memory moving forward, unless you invalidate it purposely. So basically it's .family, and then we have to have the type that will be returned, which is a MTG card, as well as the family type, string. And then we have our constructor function here, and all we're going to do is return this async function, which is MTG service.retrieve card. So now in our detail screen, we're going to wrap this whole scaffold in another builder, but change the builder to consumer. And in here, we just need to have ref, and we don't care about the third parameter. And now in here, we can go, I'm going to go data equals, and we can go ref.watch. So not read this time, watch, because we're going to be watching something that could potentially change, invoking this to build again. And we're going to get access to our MTG detail provider. And because it's a family, it's actually essentially a function we call. And the parameter of the function is going to be the family identifier, in this case, the ID. So what this actually returns is an async value of type MTG card. And in order to work with this, we actually are going to return something going data.when. And this allows us to sort of handle the different aspects of what could be happening in this async function. For instance, it might be loading. And if it's loading, we're just going to return maybe center, child, and we can use a circular progress indicator. Another thing that could happen is an error happen. Network went down, their service went down, and this allows us to have access to two things: the error itself, we'll just call E, and then the stack trace, which in the UI we don't really have any use for. But here we'll also return center, child, and we will grab maybe some text and actually put the E in here. Now E is technically dynamic, so we do need to do something like this to convert it to a string, or E.toString. But we'll just do it this way. Maybe we'll even have error in front of it. Lastly, what if it works? Let's hope it does. Data, we will just call this card. So this is actually an instance of a card. Oops. And here we won't do it as an arrow function. So actually see it's of type MTG card. And this is where we might want to return the whole scaffold. Now, I did realize that this will look kind of funny if there's no scaffold right away. So what we're actually going to return, we're going to wrap our consumer with a widget, and I'm just going to change this to scaffold. So we always have a scaffold. Instead of child, we'll do body. And we can just always have an app bar, just say app bar, and title, text, MTG card maybe. That way our scaffold will always exist, and it's the body itself that will change. So sometimes the body will be just this circular progress indicator. Sometimes it will be this error message centered. Otherwise, it might be something totally different. And here, what we're going to do is in our components, we're just going to make a new file called MTG Card Details.dart. And I'm not going to type this one out because it's just basic Flutter, but basically this is just a stateless widget that's going to take a card as a parameter. It's a single child scroll view. It's going to have some padding, and then in the column we're going to have a name. Assuming the image URL is not null, which can be the case, we're going to put in a network image using that URL, and if the text isn't null, we're going to put some text. So very basic there. And here we're going to return this by passing in the card as required. And that's all there is to it. Okay, so let's just see this in action. Let's just click on something random here, and I realize, yeah, one important thing is we might have to just rebuild here. There we go. So you'll see it's in that loading state right now. And then we get the data back. We didn't get an error, luckily. So it first was doing the loading, it never errored, and eventually we got this, the details, which is just that UI that we just made. We can click on another one. Now you notice it's kind of slow, and it's just their API is kind of slow, which is fine for this purpose of a tutorial. And in some ways, it's kind of nice to work with a slow API because you remember to put in things like loading screens and stuff like that. All right, so there you have it. Pretty basic app. Just to walk through it in general again. In our pub spec, we installed a few libraries. We have things freeze for our model generation. We have infinite scroll pagination. We're using Dio for networking, Riverpod for state management, AutoRoute for routing, and Get It for our singletons. A few other dev dependencies for things that, dealing with our auto generation and just really good developer experience. Our main.dart essentially starts with just registering that singleton, and then we run the app with a provider scope around it, which allows Riverpod to anything to have access to Riverpod's providers within it. And here we, instead of using material app, we're using material app.router so that we can pass in our router config. Now our router itself just has a list of a couple routes, and which are auto-generated based on using the decorators in our different screens. So we decorated this with route page, and that's just something that the generator is looking for to create all the things around it. In our list screen, we essentially just have a basic scaffold, and we're passing in this list. And this list itself is wrapped in a consumer because we need to get access to a Riverpod provider here. And we're getting access to this provider, which has a paging controller and a function to fetch new data and a function to refresh, which we didn't actually make use of, but easily could. Then our fetch page function calls our service that we made, and this just goes out to our api.magicthegathering.io and gets the data back, converts it to the lovely model that we made using freezed, and gives it back to us in here, which then we append the page, and thus our list is working right here. And the list tile itself, although showing a little bit of data about it, ultimately goes and redirects to a detail screen where all we're doing is passing in the ID, not the card itself, meaning the screen itself is going to be responsible for fetching that. And the reason I did it that way, because we could very easily just pass in the object itself, is we want to build this in a way that someone could come to that screen through a deep link and not have context from the screen before. And that's especially relevant for Flutter web apps. And our detail screen, very simply, is watching this card detail provider, and which goes and retrieves the card. And basically, if it's loading, it's going to return this. If there's an error, we're going to show this lovely error. And if assuming it all worked, we actually return this details, which this is just a standard Flutter widget. All right, that's it for this quick tutorial, and I hope you found something useful in it. See you in the next one.